Imagine a fighter plane that America built with high hopes, yet ended up abandoning it as a failure. A plane that U.S. pilots mocked, generals dismissed, and historians often overlooked. But at the same time, thousands of miles away, that very same aircraft was treated like a gift from heaven. To the Soviets, it became a war-winning machine, a deadly low-altitude hunter, and a trusted partner in the skies over the Eastern Front. Yes, we are talking about the Bell P-39 Airacobra, a plane the United States hated, but the Soviet Union absolutely loved. This contrast isn't just fascinating, it's one of the greatest paradoxes of World War II aviation. So why did the U.S. despise a fighter that the Red Army swore by? Let's dive deep into the story of the P-39 Airacobra, uncover its unusual design, its failures, its triumphs, and most importantly, why two powerful nations saw the same airplane in completely different ways. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the Airacobra went from unwanted American mistake to Soviet secret weapon. The P-39 Airacobra was born out of ambition. In the mid-1930s, aviation was rapidly evolving. The U.S. Army Air Corps wanted something revolutionary, something that could match or even outclass European fighters like the Messerschmitt, Bf-109 or the British Spitfire. Bell Aircraft, a relatively small company, proposed something radical. Instead of placing the engine in the nose, they would mount it behind the pilot, right in the middle of the fuselage. This unique, mid-engine design allowed them to add a powerful nose-mounted cannon, giving the Airacobra unmatched firepower on paper. To American engineers, this was futuristic. To generals, it looked promising. And when the first prototypes flew, the Airacobra seemed like the beginning of a new era of fighter design. But while innovation was high, reality would soon prove that every bold decision comes with consequences, both good and bad. On paper, the Airacobra looked like a killer. A 37-degrees cannon firing through the propeller hub, heavy machine guns, good armor protection, and that futuristic mid-engine placement. But the fatal flaw lay in its altitude performance. You see, Bell originally designed the P-39 with a turbo supercharger, which would have given it high-altitude capabilities, perfect for bomber escort missions. But due to budget cuts, technical complications, and the Air Corps shifting priorities, the turbocharger was removed. This decision crippled the aircraft. Without it, the P-39 simply couldn't effectively above 15,000 feet. For U.S. pilots used to engaging enemy planes at high altitudes, especially against German fighters and Japanese Zeros, this was disastrous. In American eyes, the Airacobra was underpowered, unreliable at altitude, and unfit for the air superiority role. What had once looked like a futuristic wonder now seemed like a costly mistake. But history wasn't done with the Airacobra yet. As World War II escalated, the U.S. rushed the P-39 into service. But disappointment came quickly. American pilots flying in the Pacific realized the Airacobra was no match for Japanese fighters like the Agile Zero. In Europe, it couldn't escort bombers at high altitude, making it practically useless for the missions the U.S. needed most. The Airacobra was seen as second-rate, and pilots began calling it dangerous and ineffective. To many Americans, it was a waste of resources. But here's where the twist begins. Instead of scrapping the aircraft completely, the U.S. decided to send thousands of Airacobras overseas through the Lend-Lease program. Britain received some, but they didn't like it either, calling it unsuitable for combat. Yet, when the Soviets got their hands on the P-39, everything changed. What the Americans called trash, the Soviets began calling gold. On the Eastern Front, air combat was a completely different game. Battles were fought at low to medium altitudes, often below 15,000 feet, exactly where the P-39's limitations disappeared and its strengths began to shine. The Soviets didn't need long-range, high-altitude escorts. They needed tough, heavily armed fighters that could rip through German aircraft in brutal, close-range battles. And the P-39 fit that role perfectly. Its 37-degrees cannon was devastating against German bombers and even deadly against fighters with just a few hits. Soviet aces loved the plane's armor, its stability, and its firepower. To them, it was rugged, reliable, and exactly what they needed. In fact, many of the Soviet Union's highest-scoring aces, including Alexander Pokryshkin, scored dozens of kills in the Airacobra. Suddenly, the plane America hated was becoming one of the most effective Soviet weapons in the skies. When the Soviets first received the P-39 under Lend-Lease, many pilots were skeptical. The cockpit layout was unusual, the mid-engine design felt strange, and the landing gear was tricycle style, which was uncommon at the time. But once they started flying it in real combat, opinions shifted almost overnight. Soviet pilots quickly realized that this so-called odd American plane had incredible stability at low altitude, making it easier to aim its deadly 37 mm cannon against German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Wolf 190. A single hit from the Airacobra's cannon could shatter the enemy. The plane's heavy armor also gave pilots a greater chance of surviving hits that would have killed them in lighter Soviet planes like the Yak-1. Soon, Soviet aces were requesting the P-39 by name. It was no longer an American reject. It was a battlefield monster perfectly suited to the Eastern Front. The centerpiece of the P-39's success was its cannon. While most Allied fighters relied on 50 caliber machine guns, the Airacobra's nose-mounted 37 mm cannon was like a sledgehammer compared to a hammer. Soviet pilots used this gun to devastating effect. In dogfights, a single shell could rip the wing off a Bf 109. Against bombers, 2 or 3 hits were enough to bring them crashing down. Even tanks and ground vehicles were vulnerable to low strafing runs. For the Soviets, who were locked in a brutal ground war with the Germans, this kind of firepower was priceless. American pilots often complained that the cannon was inaccurate or that it jammed easily. But Soviet mechanics modified and maintained the weapon with skill, turning it into a reliable asset. This gun, hated by Americans, became one of the most feared weapons in Soviet skies. To the Germans, hearing the Airacobra's cannon meant death was seconds away. One of the greatest testaments to the P-39's value in Soviet service lies in the kill records of its pilots. Many of the highest-scoring Soviet aces, including Alexander Pokryshkin, Grigory Rekolov, and Nikolai Galeev, scored the majority of their kills in Airacobras. Pokryshkin alone became a legend with over 59 confirmed kills, many of them in the P-39. The Soviets began calling it the Ace Maker, because pilots who mastered the Airacobra often rose quickly through the ranks with impressive kill counts. Unlike the Americans, who saw the aircraft as a liability, the Soviets saw it as a powerful equalizer against German air superiority. In fact, by the end of the war, Soviet pilots had destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft using P-39s, proving that in the right environment, this failed American fighter was actually one of the deadliest tools of the war. So why did the United States misjudge the P-39 so badly? The answer lies in the very different nature of the air wars fought by each nation. The Americans were focused on long-range bombing campaigns over Europe and carrier battles over the vast Pacific. Both required fighters with excellent high-altitude performance and long endurance. The P-39 simply couldn't do that. Without its turbo supercharger, it was useless at 25,000 feet where bomber formations flew. But on the Eastern Front, where combat was brutal, fast, and low to the ground, those flaws didn't matter. Instead, the Airacobra's strengths, armor, stability, and firepower made it a star. In other words, the U.S. didn't hate the P-39 because it was a bad plane. They hated it because it was the wrong plane for their kind of war. The Soviets loved it because it was the perfect plane for theirs. The story of the P-39 Airacobra is the perfect example of how context can change everything. In America, it was trash, a plane considered dangerous to fly, unfit for missions, and overshadowed by superior aircraft like the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. But in the Soviet Union, it became treasure, a rugged, deadly machine that helped secure victory on the Eastern Front. By war's end, the Soviets had received more than 700 Airacobras, and they used them to devastating effect. Many of their top-scoring aces considered it their favorite fighter of the war. While American history books often skip over the P-39 as a failed experiment, in Russia, it holds a place of honor. This dual legacy is what makes the Airacobra story so fascinating. It was loved and hated at the same time, by allies fighting the same enemy, simply because their needs were so different. War isn't just about weapons, it's also about psychology. And the P-39 gave Soviet pilots a powerful mental advantage. Imagine being a young Soviet aviator in 1942, facing the fearsome Luftwaffe, which had dominated Europe for years. Suddenly, you're handed a sleek American fighter with a cannon so big it could shatter enemy aircraft with 1 or 2 hits. That alone boosted confidence. Pilots who felt under-equipped in Yaks or Lend-Lease now felt like equals, or even superior, to their German opponents. This psychological edge was crucial. A confident pilot fought harder, pressed the attack longer, and often survived because he believed his machine could carry him through. American pilots, on the other hand, had the opposite reaction. They lost confidence in the P-39 because it didn't perform where they needed it most. 2 nations, 2 perspectives, and 2 very different outcomes. All tied to the same aircraft. One of the hidden strengths of the P-39 in Soviet service was its ability to double as a ground attack aircraft. With its heavy cannon and nose-mounted machine guns, it could devastate German convoys, armored vehicles, and even tanks when attacking from the side or rear. Soviet strategy often relied on disrupting German supply lines, and the Airacobra was perfect for this. Flying, fast, and heavily armed, it could strike columns of trucks or artillery positions with devastating accuracy. Unlike lighter Soviet fighters, the P-39 could take hits from anti-aircraft fire and still return home thanks to its armor plating and rugged build. For the Red Army, which desperately needed every advantage on the ground, the Airacobra became more than just a fighter. It was a multi-role weapon that added firepower to their offensives. To the Germans, the roar of an Airacobra diving low meant their tanks and trucks were in mortal danger. No story of the P-39 would be complete without mentioning Alexander Pokryshkin. He was not only one of the greatest Soviet aces, but also one of the most innovative tacticians of World War II. Pokryshkin used the Airacobra to devastating effect, rewriting Soviet air combat tactics in the process. He emphasized teamwork, surprise attacks, and maximum use of the plane's firepower. His motto, hate, speed, maneuver, fire, became legendary. Pokryshkin scored most of his victories in the P-39, proving time and again that the aircraft could dominate when used correctly. His legacy turned the Airacobra into a symbol of Soviet ingenuity, taking what others dismissed and turning it into a weapon of victory. To this day, in Russian aviation history, the P-39 is inseparable from Pokryshkin's name, and his success helped cement the fighter's reputation as more than just a Lend-Lease afterthought. Statistics often tell the real story, and the numbers behind the P-39 service are staggering. The Soviet Union received more than 4,700 Airacobras, nearly half of all P-39s ever built. By comparison, Britain rejected the aircraft after only a short trial, and the United States relegated it to secondary roles. Yet in Soviet hands, these planes flew thousands of combat sorties, shot down thousands of enemy aircraft, and became the primary mount of many of the top 20 Soviet aces. In fact, Soviet P-39 pilots collectively racked up more kills than the aircraft achieved in all other theaters combined. These numbers don't just prove the plane was effective. They highlight how mismatched it was for American needs. The P-39 wasn't bad. It was misunderstood, and the Soviets, with their unique war conditions, turned that misunderstanding into a deadly advantage. The P-39 Airacobra remains one of the most contradictory fighters of World War II. In the US, it was seen as a failure, a mistake, an aircraft that never lived up to expectations. In Britain, it was dismissed as unsuitable for combat. But in the Soviet Union, it was a hero's weapon, celebrated by pilots, respected by enemies, and remembered as a key part of victory. This contradiction tells us something important about war. There is no such thing as a universally good or bad weapon. Effectiveness depends on context, environment, and strategy. The P-39 was the wrong plane for the wrong war in American service, but the right plane for the right war in Soviet service. Its story reminds us that history is never simple. Sometimes, one nation's trash truly does become another nation's treasure. While the Soviets were writing glorious chapters with the P-39, the Americans quietly pushed it into the shadows. In U.S. service, the Airacobra saw combat early in the Pacific Theater, including Guadalcanal. But there, its lack of high-altitude performance became painfully clear. Against the nimble Japanese Zero, the P-39 often struggled. Pilots complained about sluggish climb rates and engine overheating. Some units tried to adapt it to ground attack roles, but better alternatives like the P-47 Thunderbolt soon arrived. By 1943, most American Airacobras were pulled from front-line service, replaced by superior designs. For the U.S., the P-39 became a footnote, a stepping stone in the evolution of fighter technology. But ironically, while American pilots were discarding it, Soviet pilots were making history in the exact same machine. Two nations, one plane, but two entirely different legacies. Part of what makes the P-39 so fascinating is its unique design. Few fighters in history ever placed the engine behind the pilot. This gave the aircraft a distinctive shape and allowed Bell engineers to install a long propeller shaft under the cockpit. It also created space in the nose for the 37 Dibard cannon, something no other Allied fighter of the time had. The tricycle landing gear was another innovation, offering smoother takeoffs and landings compared to tail draggers like the P-40 or P-51. Yet these innovations also created challenges. The mid-engine placement made maintenance complicated, and if the driveshaft failed, the pilot's life was at risk. To Americans, these quirks were headaches. To Soviets, they were acceptable trade-offs for the raw firepower the plane delivered. In a way, the Airacobra symbolized experimental U.S. engineering, ahead of its time, but not always practical for every mission. The Soviets didn't just fly the P-39, they adapted it. Mechanics in the field modified the cannon to reduce jamming, adjusted the gun sights for better accuracy, and even tweaked the engines to handle the harsh Russian climate. They stripped away unnecessary equipment to lighten the aircraft and focused on reliability. Soviet training schools also tailored their flight programs to teach new pilots how to maximize the P-39's strengths. Stable gun platform, heavy firepower, and survivability. This adaptability is part of why the Airacobra thrived in their hands. While Americans saw limitations, Soviets saw opportunities. They molded the P-39 into exactly what they needed, proving once again that context and creativity can turn a rejected weapon into a war-winning tool. For Soviet pilots, the Airacobra wasn't just a plane from America, it was a trusted comrade in their struggle for survival. When World War II ended, the story of the P-39 took two very different paths. In the U.S., it was quietly retired and quickly forgotten, overshadowed by legends like the Mustang, Corsair, and Lightning. It was remembered as an experiment that never reached its potential. In the Soviet Union, however, the Airacobra retained a place of honor. Veterans who flew it remembered it fondly, and many credited it with saving their lives countless times. Soviet museums preserved examples of the plane, and even decades later, Russian historians continue to celebrate its role in the Great Patriotic War. This split legacy is rare in aviation history. Few aircraft have ever been so hated by one nation, yet adored by another. The P-39 remains a symbol of how perspective shapes memory, and how the same machine can be both a failure and a hero, depending on who is telling the story. So, why did the U.S. hate the P-39 while the Soviets loved it? The answer lies not in the machine itself, but in the wars it fought. America needed high-altitude escorts for bombers, and the P-39 couldn't deliver. The Soviets needed rugged, low-altitude killers, and the P-39 delivered better than anyone expected. That's the paradox. A plane built in America, dismissed at home, became one of the Soviet Union's most beloved weapons of World War II. It armed aces, defended cities, crushed enemy bombers, and tore through German armor. In the end, the P-39 Airacobra proved that no weapon is inherently good or bad. It all depends on how and where it is used. For America, it was a disappointment. For the Soviet Union, it was a savior. And that is why the Airacobra remains one of the most misunderstood, yet most important, Fighters of the Second World War.